On the night of July 7th, 1994, somewhere in a North Korean mountain, a very old man could not catch his breath. The official story goes this way. This elderly man was working as usual. He was reading documents about Korean unification, correcting other people's paperwork in red marks, doing the sort of heavy intellectual lifting that naturally leads to a sudden cardiac arrest. That evening, he was said to be solid and decisive, no sign of fatigue, no hint of any discomfort. A deadly heart attack, and that's all. 34 hours later, the state television announced that the old man had passed away due to overwork, as if he had devoted everything, including his life, to the prosperity of the Korean nation. Here is another version of the same story, quietly spread outside the Kimdom. The same night, the same mountain villa. The founding father of the People's Republic started to feel pain in his chest. He tried to reach for the people who always surround him, the country's best medical team that had followed him for decades. But this time, there wasn't the usual team of 8, but only 2. The cardiologist, the doctor whose job was literally taking care of the great leader's heart, was absent. It was a minor administrative oversight, and it happened when this old man was facing a nuclear crisis, a famine, and preparing for a historic summit with its sworn enemy at the same time. Wait, here is the third version. That night, heavy rain poured over Mount Myohyang, and radar screens in the south suddenly lit up as several aircraft took off from Pyongyang. The great leader had a heart attack, and immediately, a helicopter full of doctors was sent to rescue him. Then, the helicopter crashed into the mountain, and a frantic ambulance run ended with a car off a cliff, so every attempt to save the leader was swallowed by weather, bad luck, and poor driving skills. By the time the best doctors in the country reached him, the man who built the Kimdom was well beyond any help, and the only thing left to resuscitate was the narrative. One corpse, 3 stories. The fact that Comrade Kim Il-sung died on July 7, 1994, due to a heart attack, was framed into different versions. Different narratives appear in North Korean newspapers, Tokyo newsrooms, South Korean intelligence reports, and in the private notes of defectors and exiles. And among them, a pretty wild theory claims the incident was not a negligent failure in the chain of command, but a quiet family murder, a North Korean patricide. In this episode, we examine one of North Korea's most mysterious events, the death of Kim Il-sung. It's a story about a tireless old revolutionary whose body became a prop in a family drama about succession, loyalty, and fear. We trace how Pyongyang manufactures narratives, how outsiders project their own fantasies onto the Kim family, and how rumors, from simple negligence to deliberate patricide, tell more about the deadly North Korean succession game. But before we begin, time to express our gratitude toward our channel members. Your funding enables us to read memoirs, defector testimonies, and badly formatted intelligence reports to produce this episode. Thank you. Now, buckle up, let's begin.
The president had repeated discussions with the officials about the country's economic work and the people's living, and gave them important instructions to provide the Korean people with happiness.
It was the morning of July 9th, 1994. Every factory, school, and army unit of the Kimdom received the same order. At noon, there will be an important announcement on television. Everyone must watch. Nobody was told what it was, but people already had a guess. Just the day before, all senior cadres disappeared from the public view, and the usual flood of Kim Il-sung quotes thinned out from newspapers. At exactly 12, Korean Central Television cut to a black-suited announcer. His face was rigid, and his voice was shaking. He unfolded a sheet of paper and began reading the sentence that the entire state had spent 34 hours preparing. The General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, President of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, great leader Comrade Kim Il-sung, passed away unexpectedly at 2 a.m. on July 8th, Juche 83, from a sudden heart attack. North Korea's statement insisted the 82-year-old had suffered a myocardial infarction brought on by mental overwork and long-term heart disease, and that despite all possible treatment, he had passed away in the early morning. By then, the country's leadership had spent 34 hours deciding how to frame the great leader's death without disclosing any info. As soon as the sentence was read, the ritual began. A 10-day national mourning period was declared from July 8th to 17th. The flag was flown at half-mast across the country. All entertainment and dancing were banned. Bright clothes, makeup, and weddings were quietly discouraged. Ordinary people even voluntarily postponed their own funerals because no one dared hold a private ceremony while the state's own funeral was underway. In Pyongyang, millions were ordered to cry on command. Workers, students, and soldiers lined up to wail before the big bronze statue of Kim on Mansudae Hill. The funeral procession, when it finally came on July 19th, was broadcast as a 3.5-hour opera of controlled hysteria. A long black hearse rolls through the city, flanked by Jong Il and his trusted comrades, while crowds collapse in rehearsed despair. The state media assured viewers that the country was now wrapped in the greatest sorrow in 5,000 years. Radio Pyongyang announced that Kim's body would lie at the presidential palace, later reborn as the Kumsusan Memorial Palace, and eventually the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, a mausoleum where his embalmed corpse was displayed under glass and shining for eternity. From that moment on, the official line became simple and non-negotiable. The great leader died of a sudden illness, brought on by lifelong dedication and stress, and the son, the great successor, Jong Il, would carry on his will and inherit the kingdom. It was a convincing and reassuring narrative. The elderly dictator with known heart problems, under intense pressure from a nuclear standoff and a planned inter-Korean summit, dies of heart failure. Chinese declassified diplomatic cables basically agree. Kim had serious cardiovascular disease. Chinese doctors were called to Pyongyang several times in 1993, and stress from nuclear negotiations likely pushed him over the edge. If you stop there, Kim Il-sung's death is tragic but boring. But of course, nobody stopped there. Outside the kingdom, especially in Japan and South Korea, the same basic facts were rearranged into something fascinating. The capitalist news reporters and analysts looked at the timeline and saw a thriller outline. Kim collapses from a heart attack at his mountain residence around midday on July 7th, and he was officially pronounced dead 14 hours later. This death was announced at 12 p.m. on July 9th, after a 34-hour blackout. From there, people started to write their own theory of the crime.
The Korean people are living still thinking as if the president would come to their workplaces and embrace them with affection just as he had done in his lifetime.
In 2004, non-fiction author Hagiwara Ryo published Jong Il's Hidden War, arguing that the 1994 heart attack and the later famine were not just misfortune, but parts of a hidden war waged by Jong Il to secure and exercise power. Ryo puts it bluntly. In 1994, father and son were in deep conflict over the country's direction. Kim Il-sung's mysterious death and the subsequent starvation policy against domestic enemies were the two sides of the same story. Basically, Jong Il had a secret plot and murdered his father. You might think this claim is wild, since it deviates so much from the Pyongyang narrative of filial piety and revolutionary bloodline. But wait, here are some supporting details. The first was Kim Il-sung's health. Kim Il-sung was visibly old, heavily overworked, and physically declining. But he had never been publicly identified as a heart patient, nor had any signs of imminent death. The 82-year-old great leader took on so many tasks, including Inter-Korea Summit and nuclear talks, precisely because he felt good about himself. Less than a month before his death, he was still greeting the former US President Jimmy Carter in person and planning to reach an agreeable nuclear deal with the Clinton administration. There were some defectors' accounts of Kim's health condition. Hwang Jang-yop, the real inventor of the Juche idea, later claimed Kim Il-sung already showed symptoms like incontinence, and during the Carter meeting, his hands reportedly trembled. But he still managed to be a decent host. Considering his seniority, his trembling hands were not a big problem. After the meeting, he threw himself into Inter-Korea Summit preparations, worked long hours, traveled in bad weather to inspect grain conditions in the countryside, got angry over falsified reports, and arrived at his villa at Mount Myohyang like the man in charge. At a meeting, he ordered the release of military grain to alleviate the food scarcity. On July 6th, the day before his death, he asked subordinates about the ongoing railway construction because the South Korean President Kim Jong-sam was expected to come by train for summit preparations. Did he look like an old man ready to die? Hardly so. An elderly ruler with known cardiovascular disease took on immense political pressure and had a sudden, fatal attack. Come on, don't be so naive. This is Pyongyang's narrative, and only God knows how credible it is. The second reason was timing. Kim Il-sung died at the single most politically sensitive moment of his final years. The American Goodwill Ambassador Jimmy Carter just visited Pyongyang and made historical progress in the denuclearization of the Korea Peninsula. The first Inter-Korean Summit was being prepared and was supposed to be held by the end of the same month. South Korea's newly declassified diplomatic records confirmed that the summit was well planned. You know, it was 1994. The big Soviet brother had disintegrated 3 years ago, and North Korea was on the brink of a great famine. Retrospectively speaking, Kim Il-sung made the right move. The Cold War was over, and he knew that North Korea couldn't solely rely on the Juche spirit to solve its food problem. Some kinds of détente or rapprochement were necessary to develop North Korea's economy and beg for international food aid. Guess what? Suddenly, the Grandpa Kim was gone, and the summit died with him. The successor, Jong Il, cancelled everything, went into symbolic mourning for years, and buried his father's last big diplomatic project with him. In fact, 3 days after Kim Il-sung died, North Korea formally notified Seoul that all high-level talks would be postponed, and the summit was effectively dead. This was not a minor scheduling inconvenience, but shall be considered a murder motive. The father was making the biggest diplomatic move in his lifetime, potentially easing nuclear tensions, and maybe even opening the door to limited accommodation with the outside world, as most socialist states did after the Cold War. The son, by contrast, inherited power through control, siege mentality, and political caution. Jong Il wanted total control of the Kimdom and to make nuclear weapons a diplomatic bargaining chip. By then, Kim Il-sung's existence had become very inconvenient for the heir. Next, the doctors. Even official North Korean material admits that when Kim Il-sung fell down in the villa, the medical response was not ideal. The story goes like this. The eternal president suddenly complained of chest pain, collapsed, and his personal medical staff was the first responder. Then, Jong Il ordered that the best doctors in the country be brought from Pyongyang, and a special medical helicopter was dispatched to ferry them in. The daddy Kim was moved to the Ponghwa clinic in the capital, where he was pronounced dead at 2 a.m., despite all intensive efforts. Have you sensed something? If the man already had the best doctors, why did Jong Il send another team from the capital, which was hundreds of kilometers away? If they knew the leader had a cardiac problem, shouldn't he have the country's best cardiologists and proper equipment by his side 24/7? The later Japanese and South Korean retellings emphasized that the medical arrangements around Kim Il-sung were strangely thin for a man of his age and importance. Key doctors were absent, the first response was inadequate, and emergency treatment was delayed, while additional specialists had to be summoned from Pyongyang. The most important body of the Kimdom stopped working, and the system he built failed spectacularly. So dubious, isn't it? Fourth, the 34-hour blackout. Kim Il-sung died at 2 a.m. on July 8th. The country was not told it until noon on July 9th. People, even dictators, die, but they rarely come with a 34-hour silence. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, died on February 28, 2026. His death was confirmed on the morning of March 1st. The wartime Iran did a much quicker job than North Korea. For 34 hours, no radio announcement, no emergency bulletin, no hint that the man who appears on every wall and banknote is no longer ticking. To the suspicious minds, those 34 hours are not about sadness, but were used to negotiate. Jong Il secured the loyalty of generals, locked down possible rivals, purged anyone who might be tempted to propose a collective leadership, and created a narrative to convince his 20 million subjects that he, the great successor, had become the new supreme leader. In other words, he murdered his father, so he had to block the investigation, clean up the crime scene, and make a cover-up story. Finally, the whispers. No good murder story relies on analysis alone. There must be anecdotes, ideally with just enough detail to be impossible to check. Over the years, defectors and former regime insiders have been adding up the seasoning. One former official recalls that Kim Il-sung returned from a field inspection furious about fake grain reports and shouted that military reserves must be released to the people. Another claims he heard that Jong Il opposed any talk of unification that involved food aid and inspection from the puppet regime of the South. Someone else swears that on the evening of July 7th, Jong Il personally phoned the villa and ordered the medical team home. The helicopter story, too, grows with each telling. In some versions, a single helicopter crashed into the side of Mount Myoyang in heavy rain, killing all the emergency team. In others, the first chopper got lost, the second landed too late, and an ambulance then skidded off a mountain road. Nobody can produce a flight log, a wreckage photo, or the name of any pilot, but the mental image is vivid. Believe these hearsay or not, they certainly made the story more spooky and gripping. So, this is basically the patricide theory. Jong Il, under immense disagreements about the direction of the country with his father, murdered his dad while he was in a remote villa, and then made an excellent cover-up story to finish the succession. You might think that each piece of evidence is weak on its own. A bad heart, a cancelled summit, a delayed announcement, a muddled emergency response. None of these proves the murder theory. But once you combine them, bingo. A father conveniently died for the power-wanting son. A medical crisis followed by a well-managed afterwards silence. The Japanese and South Korean speculators pieced them into a story in which Jong Il is the supervillain.
The 6th Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, held in 1980, reviewed the successes achieved in the revolution and construction since its 5th Congress and unfolded a new plan. The Congress demonstrated to the whole world that the Workers' Party of Korea, which organizes and guides all victories of the Korean people under the leadership of President Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong Il, is an ever-victorious party.
The murder theory turned a murky succession into a family crime. And this capitalist conspiracy had a certain appeal among North Koreans themselves, especially when famine and repression made the Kim Jong-il years look far worse than the final years of Kim Il-sung. Within the Kimdom, this wild, wild story became a way to explain why the country went from bad to catastrophic. The son had killed the national father and then killed the nation's future. To understand why the murder theory spread so easily, we must travel back to the summer of 1994 and try to understand the post-Cold War geopolitics. During the Cold War, North Korea mattered far beyond its size. It sat at one of the most dangerous truce lines on Earth, between US-allied South Korea on one side and Communist China and the Soviet bloc on the other. It functioned as a buffer state on China's border, a frontline anti-US outpost, and a useful client in socialist competition. Our great leader performed an excellent balancing act between China and the Soviet Union, requiring aid from both countries while preserving his nation's autonomy. With subsidized oil and foreign technological transfer, North Korea quickly recovered from the Korean War and made its southern neighbor jealous for a while. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and the structure of the world changed. Bye-bye to the big brother Russia. North Korea lost its economic life support system. China did not fully abandon Pyongyang, but it reduced support and increasingly demanded cash payment rather than old-style socialist credit. A comparison with other socialist states is revealing. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia broke up into its constituent members. Poland had Lech Walesa. Czechoslovakia became Czech and Slovakia. 2 Germanys got unified. Good for them. China had already begun market reform under Deng Xiaoping. Vietnam launched Doi Moi in 1986 and moved toward a socialist market economy. Cuba, after losing Soviet subsidies, suffered badly in the special period, but still adjusted through tourism and foreign remittances. North Korea, by contrast, reformed nothing. It remained the most rigid of the surviving socialist states, with very limited foreign investment, and harshly resisted any market reform. By 1994, Kim Il-sung was not only the leader of an isolated dictatorship, He was presiding over the last truly Stalinist holdout in the socialist bloc, at the exact moment when every other socialist survivor was forced to accept some degree of marketization and democracy. In this situation, the Juche self-reliance was starting to look like self-strangulation. So when the leader pursued Carter diplomacy and prepared for a summit with the South, his new foreign policy raised a critical question. How would North Korea adapt to the post-Soviet New World Order? At the same time, Pyongyang was facing the first great nuclear standoff of the post-Cold War world. The Clinton administration was pressuring North Korea over inspections and the nuclear program. Washington was openly discussing harder options. Seoul was watching nervously. Beijing was trying to prevent a complete breakdown. And right in the middle of all this, Kim Il-sung tried diplomacy. That was where Jimmy Carter entered the stage to save Northeast Asia from the Korean brothers. Carter came to Pyongyang in June 1994, met Kim Il-sung for hours, and brought back a peaceful solution that seemed too good to be true. Their agreement eventually became the 1994 Agreed Framework, about freezing and replacing North Korea's nuclear power plant program with more nuclear proliferation-resistant, light water reactor power plants. However, this future was not as promising as it sounded. The patricide theory made the great leader look like some late-life reformer who was about to rescue North Korea from itself, only to be murdered by his paranoid son before he could do anything meaningful. Here is the catch. Kim Il-sung was not preparing to become the Korean Gorbachev. He was not about to dissolve the system he had built with decades of purges, war rhetoric, and personality cult. But he at least understood one thing. As our comrade Lucius says, enriched uranium doesn't feed people. The Kim regime could not survive on revolutionary posters, anti-imperialist postures, and portraits of a smiling leader. Some kind of opening and diplomatic détente was necessary. And here we reach the real question. Was there actually a serious political beef between Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong Il? The father and son likely did have different instincts about how to preserve the regime. Kim Il-sung belonged to the founding generation. He had created the system, fought wars, balanced Moscow and Beijing, survived internal purges, and thought in grand historical achievements, not those petite policies. For him, a summit with the South was a historical moment, a generational legacy, something to be written in history books for hundreds of years. Thus, after Carter left, Kim Il-sung reportedly worked almost without rest, arranging summit plans and reception matters, while Kim Jong-il, supposedly unwell himself, continued to shoulder relatively lighter duties and push large burdens back onto the father. Kim Jong-il belonged to a different political generation. He inherited the Kim dynasty, which produced a different mentality. Founders can sometimes improvise because they believe the system is their creation. Heirs are usually more suspicious and believe the system is fragile, since they know a modern-day hereditary dictatorship is bad and ugly. This is why the alleged conflict was not really about reform versus status quo, but more about different methods of control. Kim Il-sung may have believed that one summit, another round of diplomacy, some breathing space bought with smiles and handshakes, could stabilize the regime before he could fully step down. Kim Jong-il, by contrast, likely feared that too much opening, too quickly, under the father's name, would create new expectations, empower the wrong people, and complicate his own succession. That is not a small disagreement, which would trigger some policy debate in other normal countries. But disagreement is not the same thing as a murderous plot. This is where the conspiracy theory gets a little too excited and starts writing fan fiction. there is very little evidence that the father and the son stood for fundamentally different systems and different political values. I mean, does it make sense to you that a socialist dictator who reinvented a backward hereditary system of succession had his last moment of conscience and tried to democratize North Korea? Again, he was not secretly planning to become the Korean Gorbachev, nor was he preparing to throw Juche into the Taedong River and open the country for Motorola and Coca-Cola. The Kim clan ultimately wanted the same thing, which was the survival of the Kim regime under its familial leadership. And Kim Jong Il, for all his later reputation as the patron saint of siege mentality, was not allergic to diplomacy either. If hosting summits with South Korea were truly against his creed and doctrine, why did he organize the first inter-Korean summit in 2000 with the South Korean president Kim Dae-jung? In 2007, he did a round 2 with Roh Moo-hyun. He also negotiated with the United States when the time suited him, signed deals when they were useful, and accepted aid when starvation made his brainwashing mechanism less effective. So, the claim that Kim Jong Il saw diplomacy as something despicable does not really hold. The idea of a major father-son split should be considered with extra caution. They both wanted to keep North Korea their private asset. The mere difference was that Kim Il-sung wanted to manage the country with his own authority, prestige, and historic aura. But Kim Jong-il wanted to write his own story and create his own leadership style. One wanted to make history. The other wanted to manage succession and outlive his father's shadow. Both were still trying to preserve the same family state.
Having cherished long the plan to build a larger number of buildings that serve the people as intended by President Kim Il-sung, he clarified the ways for applying socialist content to national form in construction.
Now we come to the ultimate question. Did Kim Jong-il have any motives to kill his father? By 1994, Kim Jong-il was not some underdog prince waiting outside the palace with a kitchen knife and an inferiority complex. He had been groomed for succession for a really long time. He was officially designated as the successor during the 1980 Party Congress, and by the early 90s, he held senior posts in the Central Committee, Politburo, and Party Secretariat. In other words, the succession had been rehearsed for years, leaving no room for political deviation. The murder theory loves the sense of urgency. It imagined Kim Jong-il in a state of desperate panic, as if the throne might be stolen at any moment by a reformist uncle, a collective leadership committee, or perhaps some brave democratic reformers. But the actual structure of power looked very different. Kim Jong-il had spent almost 2 decades building himself into the system, making him well embedded in the socialist machine. He became the first vice chairman of the National Defense Commission in 1990, then the supreme commander of the Korean People's Army in December 1991, and finally the chairman of the National Defense Commission in April 1993, after a constitutional adjustment had made it possible for that office to be separated from Kim Il-sung's presidency. In a military-heavy dictatorship, Kim Jong-il held real power, not a puppet prince under Daddy Kim's absolute control. Some internal accounts claim that, in the early 1990s, even some of Kim Il-sung's decisions needed his son's approval. So by the time his father died, the great successor already stood astride the army and the party. Kim Jong-il became the de facto leader of North Korea immediately after his father's death, though it took him a few more years to formalize some of the top titles. He became head of the Workers' Party in 1997, while in the next year, the idea of presidency itself was retired from the constitution and only reserved posthumously for Kim Il-sung as eternal president. Kim Jong Il's National Defense Commission chairmanship became the state's highest office. After seeing the big picture, the son didn't need to murder his way into the top office. The office had long been exclusively reserved for him. This weakens the conspiracy in a very boring way. Why would the chief commander of the Korean People's Army want to kill his father so urgently and desperately? In fact, one could argue the opposite. Keeping Kim Il-sung alive may actually be more useful to Kim Jong Il. A living national father absorbs blame, commands loyalty and reverence, and stabilizes succession simply by breathing and appearing on TV. Imagine you are the great successor, and you know the country is heading toward a humanitarian disaster. Would you rather keep your father alive and help manage the crisis, or murder him and put the blame for the famine entirely on your shoulders? The answer is very obvious. If anything, inheriting North Korea in 1994 was not like inheriting a luxury beach resort. It was a brittle Stalinist monarchy whose economic life support had just been unplugged. And what about the cancelled summit? Wasn't Kim Jong Il afraid of the potential Korean unification? Yes, Kim Il-sung's death killed the planned summit meeting with Kim Young-sam. But again, Kim Jong Il's later career complicates the murder motive. He hosted 2 inter-Korean summits, and neither brought us to the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, let alone a peaceful reunification. A more likely explanation is that the 1997 meeting was cancelled because it was Kim Il-sung's summit and diplomatic triumph. Kim Jong Il wanted his own diplomatic achievement, not to attribute historical progress to his daddy. He wanted his summit meetings calibrated to his needs, timed to his leverage, and choreographed to strengthen his rule. That may sound selfish and manipulative because it was, but mere selfishness is not a murder motive. Besides, the medical helicopter tale is merely hearsay. The shaky emergency response, even if true in broad outline, does not automatically point to any foul play. That is the awkward thing about heart attacks. These cardiac arrests are dramatically useful in conspiracy stories precisely because they are medically plausible, fast, and often frustratingly hard to reverse. A serious myocardial infarction does not politely wait for a better equipped hospital, nor does it care that the patient is the eternal president or any dictator else. Sometimes there are earlier symptoms, sometimes only vague discomfort, fatigue, indigestion, or chest tightness that people ignore until the body simply gives up. In other words, even if everything during the medical response went wrong, it still could not prove that someone engineered the heart attack. The truth, perhaps, was very simple. It was an administrative chaos that happened in a remote mountain villa, and an old man was killed by the very system that claimed to keep him immortal. All these facts leave us with an awkward conclusion. The murder theory is emotionally satisfying because it turns one of the ugliest power transitions in modern socialist history into a family crime with a bad villain. But the actual DPRK power structure makes that crime less necessary than the theory wants it to be.
Kim Jong Il was always with President Kim Il-sung. Kim Jong Il developed a huge idea, Kim Il-sung's creation into an idea guiding the times, and exalted Kim Il-sung's revolutionary achievements. He brought what Kim Il-sung intended to reality and drew reward for his hard work in Kim Il-sung's satisfaction and people's happiness.
By now, our story stops being about North Korea's most infamous murder mystery and turns out to be a story about rumor itself. The Patricide conspiracy is so catching because North Korea is the kind of country where rumors are the closest thing available to public investigation. The origin of the story was simple. Kim Il-sung died suddenly. The regime waited 34 hours before telling the public, and the son inherited the state without any independent investigation of what really happened. There was no public medical report, no autopsy released to the world, no open questioning of doctors, no press conference, no forensic detail, zero possibility for journalists to check the scene or the medical chain of command. Everyone got the official narrative delivered to their doors, and no questions might be asked. That is exactly the kind of environment in which conspiracy theories thrive. In an open society, a leader's sudden death may still generate rumors, like the assassination of JFK, but some of the rumors can be verified or nullified. There are hospital leaks. Officials might contradict one another. Journalists would go investigate and ask rude questions. Family members talk to the press. Classified documents will be declassified one day. And there are reality TV shows where medical experts argue about the cause of death. In North Korea, none of that exists. The state tells one story, and everyone else is left to build the rest from whispers, inference, and memory. Dictatorship manufactures an informational vacuum, and people naturally rush to fill it by themselves. In Japan and South Korea, instead of just saying the death felt strange, those suspicious minds framed it as a possible patricide, a son removing the father at the most sensitive possible moment. It fits very neatly with what many people thought of Jong Il's rule. Since his years in power were associated with famine, repression, and a harsher political atmosphere, it was tempting to imagine that the darkness had begun with an original sin. Another reason was that it matched the general image of a communist dictatorship. Opaque leadership, sealed archives, scripted grief, staged continuity, and no public truth. The very political system made murder feel plausible. In a state where even grain figures were lies, why would anyone trust the state's explanation for the leader's death? The theory did not need hard evidence to feel believable. It only needed North Korea to continue being North Korea. The theory further allowed many North Koreans and outside observers to divide the history of the Kim regime into two separate eras. The father's era, whatever its brutality, could be remembered as stable, functional, and promising. Then the son's era is blamed for the Great Famine and the deeper descent into fear and deprivation. The rumor became a way of explaining the nation's decline. It's not about the son who inherited a broken country, but the son who broke the country from the get-go. So, this is the genealogy of the North Korean patricide conspiracy. A sudden death, an information blackout, a state built on secrecy, and a succession too important to be explained boringly. Many foreign journalists, defectors, analysts, and ordinary people simply felt that the official version was too smooth and dubious. Some added evidence, others added imagination, and boom. Over time, the story became less a claim to be proven than a myth that explained why the Kim Jong Il era felt so much darker than what came before. What if? Let's say what if Kim Il-sung had been kept alive for one more year and made his diplomatic breakthrough? It is a tempting fantasy. The old guerrilla patriarch survives the summer of 1994, welcomes the South Korean puppet president to Pyongyang, shakes hands for the cameras, and claims one final historical victory before death. It could be a more stable political thaw. North Korea gets food aid, energy assistance, and a little geopolitical breathing room. The famine is softened. The nuclear crisis cools off. The founder of the Kimdom then leaves the stage as the man who finally opened the door to inter-Korea reconciliation. You can see why people like this alternate timeline. It is generous to the father and harsh to the son. It lets Kim Il-sung play the role of the final statesman who understood that ideology could not be boiled down to soup. And it makes Kim Jong-il look even worse by comparison. If Kim Il-sung had lived one more year, there is a decent chance the immediate downfalling trajectory would be less disastrous. His prestige may have made it easier to justify tactical flexibility without making the system feel like it was surrendering to the capitalist bloc. The founder had one enormous advantage over his son. He could bend doctrine without appearing weak, because he was the doctrine. But this is just a fantasy. Even if Kim Il-sung had lived longer, he was not preparing to democratize North Korea, dissolve the party state, or tell the people that the whole Juche thing had actually become a fever dream. Any diplomatic breakthrough he achieved would still have been designed to preserve the regime, not transform it. The purpose of talks with the South, with Washington, with anyone, was about survival, not freedom. The harder truth is that even this better timeline is not much better. Kim Jong-il himself later worked on diplomacy and special economic zones. He opened the Kaesong Industrial Complex and pushed forward the Mount Kumgang tourism project. Northern workers stitched and assembled for southern firms, while the state collected hard currency with the same paternal tenderness a pickpocket reserves for a distracted tourist. On paper, this looked like an economic adaptation. In practice, North Korea exploited its workers as state assets. The regime had some minor reforms, but never stopped suffocating its citizens. Nowadays, North Korea remains exactly what it was 30 years ago. It is a dynastic dictatorship built on surveillance, coercion, and extraction. Whatever the economic policy changes, the vast majority of the North Korean citizens remain poor, controlled, and permanently disposable, useful whenever the regime needed loyalty, tears, or cheap hands. The discomforting truth is that keeping Kim Il-sung alive would not change the fate of the North Korean people. In North Korea, the system is the real murderer.